In the vast emptiness of space, where civilizations rise and fall like waves against cosmic shores, there exists a universal truth that every species learns too late: never underestimate the quiet ones. The Galactic Council had ruled for 10,000 years, their ivory towers built on the bones of lesser races, their peace maintained through fear and overwhelming force. They had catalogued every species, every world, every possible threat to their dominion. Their files were perfect, their intelligence absolute. Or so they believed. Deep in the restricted archives of the Council's central database, behind 17 layers of quantum encryption, lay a single file marked with warnings in 12 languages. The header read simply: Species Designation, Human Terra Prime Classification, Death World Survivors, Threat Level, Redacted. The file had been sealed for 3 centuries. The beings who created it were long dead, their warnings forgotten by bureaucrats who had never seen war, never felt the cold touch of real fear. To them, humans were just another primitive species from a backwater world, barely worth monitoring. They were about to learn why their predecessors had been terrified enough to bury this information so deep that even they had forgotten it existed. The call had gone out across the galaxy: send us your champion. It was meant as mockery, a final cruel joke before the execution. The Council needed to make an example, to show the Outer Rim colonies what happened to those who dared defy their rule. They never imagined that somewhere in the black, on a small blue world they barely remembered, someone would actually answer that call. The universe was about to remember why some files carry warnings for a reason. The transmission crackled through the static of deep space, weak and desperate, carrying across light years of empty void to reach the small monitoring station orbiting Earth's moon. Lieutenant Sarachin pulled off her headphones and stared at the translation matrix, reading the message 3 times before she believed what she was seeing. "Ma'am, you need to see this," she called to Commander Harrison, who was reviewing supply manifests at his desk. The cramped observation post had been quiet for months, monitoring routine merchant traffic and occasional scientific expeditions. Nothing ever happened out here in humanity's small corner of the galaxy. Harrison walked over, his weathered face showing the fatigue of another long shift. "What is it, Chen? Another lost freighter?" "No, sir. It's a distress call, but not from one of ours." She handed him the translated message. "It's from something called the Outer Rim Coalition. They're asking for help." Harrison read the message, his eyebrows rising with each line. The coalition spoke of something called the Galactic Council, of worlds burning and populations enslaved. They described weapons that could crack planets and fleets that numbered in the millions. Most importantly, they spoke of a desperate last stand, a final gamble against impossible odds. "Send us your champion," Harrison read aloud. "We know the galaxy sees us as primitives, but our need is great. The Council comes for us all, and we have nowhere else to turn. Send us your greatest warrior, your finest strategist, your deadliest weapon. Send us hope." "Sir, should I forward this to command?" Chen asked. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the stars. "Yes. But, Chen, make sure it gets flagged for Admiral Morrison personally. Something tells me this is bigger than a routine first contact scenario." 3 days later, deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, Admiral Morrison sat in a secure conference room with 12 of humanity's most senior military officers and intelligence analysts. The room hummed with tension as they reviewed everything they knew about the message and its implications. "The linguistic analysis confirms it," Dr. Elizabeth Warren said, adjusting her glasses as she reviewed the data on her tablet. "This coalition represents at least 47 different species across hundreds of star systems. The technology required for this kind of long-range communication suggests they're significantly more advanced than us." General Rodriguez leaned back in his chair. "And they're getting their asses kicked by this council. What does that tell us about our chances if this conflict spreads?" "Nothing good," Morrison replied grimly. "But there's something else we need to consider. Intel pulled some interesting data from our deep space monitoring arrays. The energy signatures mentioned in the Coalition's message match unusual readings we've been picking up for the past 6 months." The room fell silent. Lieutenant Colonel Park, head of Strategic Intelligence, spoke first. "You think this council knows about us?" "I think it's possible. And if they do, it's only a matter of time before they come calling. The question is, do we wait for that to happen, or do we act now while we still have the element of surprise?" Dr. Warren frowned. "Admiral, with respect, we're talking about intervening in an interstellar war. We have exactly zero experience with alien civilizations, and our most advanced starship can barely make it to Proxima Centauri. Which is why, Morrison said slowly, we're going to send exactly one person. The room erupted in confused voices, but Morrison held up a hand for silence.
Think about it. They asked for a champion, not a fleet.
They're desperate enough to reach out to a species they've never met, asking for help they can't possibly expect us to provide.
This isn't about overwhelming force. This is about making a statement. General Rodriguez shook his head.
Jim, you're talking about sending one person against an interstellar empire.
That's not strategy, that's suicide.
Morrison stood and walked to the wall display, pulling up files he'd been reviewing for the past 2 days.
Maybe.
Or maybe it's exactly what the situation calls for.
Tell me, what do you know about Marcus Cole?
The name drew blank looks around the table except from Colonel Park, whose expression grew suddenly serious.
The Shadow Walker?
Sir, I thought that was classified above our clearance level.
It was. Until yesterday.
Morrison touched the display, and a file appeared that was so heavily redacted it looked more like abstract art than a personnel record.
Marcus Cole. Age 35.
Former Navy SEAL, Delta Force, and 3 other units so classified I can't even tell you their names. For the past 8 years, he's been our answer to problems that officially don't exist. The sparse details that weren't blacked out painted a picture that made everyone in the room uncomfortable.
Operations on 6 continents. Confirmed kills in the triple digits.
A man who could disappear into any environment and emerge months later with objectives completed that larger military forces had failed to achieve.
He's a ghost, Park said quietly. Most of the intelligence community thinks he's a myth. He's very real. And, right now, he's between assignments. Morrison turned back to the group.
The coalition asked for our champion. By every metric that matters, Marcus Cole is exactly that.
Dr. Warren looked pale.
Admiral, you're talking about sending a single soldier against an advanced alien civilization.
How is he supposed to even reach them, let alone make a difference?
Morrison smiled for the first time since the meeting began.
That's where things get interesting.
3 months ago, our deep space monitoring picked up a derelict vessel in the asteroid belt. The technology is clearly alien, and our engineers think they can get it running. It won't be fast, and it won't be comfortable, but it'll get him there.
And then, what? Rodriguez demanded. Assuming he survives the trip, what's one man supposed to do against an empire?
What he's always done, Morrison replied.
Find the enemy's weakness and exploit it.
The coalition's message mentioned something interesting: the council rules through fear and overwhelming displays of force.
They've never faced an enemy that refuses to be intimidated. They've never dealt with someone who thinks asymmetric warfare is just another Tuesday.
The room was quiet for several minutes as everyone digested the implications. Finally, Colonel Park spoke up.
Sir, there's something else to consider. If we do this, we're announcing humanity's presence on the galactic stage. There's no going back from that. Morrison nodded. I know.
But the alternative is waiting for this council to find us anyway, and dealing with them from a position of complete ignorance. At least this way, we get some intelligence about what we're facing.
And if Cole doesn't come back? Dr. Warren asked.
Then, we'll know we tried. And we'll start preparing for war.
Morrison looked around the room at each face in turn. I'm not going to pretend this isn't the biggest gamble in human history.
But sometimes the biggest risks offer the biggest rewards. The coalition is offering us a chance to make allies before we need them, to learn about threats before they reach our doorstep, and to prove that humanity belongs among the stars. General Rodriguez was the first to speak.
What does Cole think about all this? Morrison's expression grew slightly amused. I haven't told him yet.
But, knowing Marcus, he'll probably just ask when he leaves. The meeting continued for another 3 hours, covering logistics, communication protocols, and contingency plans. By the end, they had the framework for humanity's first interstellar military operation. It would be dangerous, probably suicidal, and completely unprecedented. It was also, they all agreed, probably their only shot at survival in a galaxy that was far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. As the meeting broke up, Morrison remained behind, staring at the classified files still displayed on the wall. Marcus Cole had never failed a mission, but he'd also never faced anything like this.
The Admiral hoped that humanity's reputation for the impossible would be enough.
Somewhere in the asteroid belt, alien technology hummed with power for the first time in centuries, waiting to carry humanity's answer to the stars. The universe was about to learn that some species were far more dangerous than their files suggested.
The hunt was about to begin.
Marcus Cole stood in the hangar bay looking at what might generously be called a spacecraft, though it looked more like someone had welded together parts from a dozen different machines and hoped for the best. The alien vessel they'd recovered was roughly the size of a small house, its hull a dark metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Strange symbols covered its surface, and the engineers had assured him that most of them probably weren't warnings about imminent death. "She's not much to look at," Chief Engineer Santos said, wiping grease from her hands with a rag that had seen better days.
"But we've managed to get the main systems operational. Life support, propulsion, basic navigation. The translation matrix is functional, though I wouldn't bet my life on its accuracy."
Marcus walked around the vessel, taking in every detail with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to spot potential problems before they killed him.
How fast? Faster than light, which is the good news. The bad news is that the trip to Coalition space will take about 6 weeks.
The really bad news is that we have no idea how to operate most of the advanced systems.
The weapons, for instance, seem to require some kind of neural interface that we haven't figured out yet.
So I'll be flying blind into hostile territory in a ship I don't understand, carrying weapons I can't use.
Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Sounds like Tuesday. Santos stared at him. You're not concerned?
Ma'am, I once spent 3 months behind enemy lines with nothing but a knife and a half-empty water bottle. Compared to that, this is luxury accommodations. He ran his hand along the hull, noting the texture of the alien metal.
What about communication? That's actually our one stroke of luck. The ship's communication array is incredibly sophisticated.
You'll be able to maintain contact with Earth until you're about halfway there, and, after that, you should be able to communicate with the Coalition once you're in their space. Admiral Morrison approached from across the hangar, carrying a sealed case that Marcus recognized as containing his mission briefing and equipment.
How are we looking, Chief?
As ready as we'll ever be, sir. The ship's loaded with supplies, and we've managed to program basic navigation routes based on the Coalition's transmission data. Morrison turned to Marcus.
Any questions about the mission parameters?
Marcus had read the briefing 3 times, but the core mission remained beautifully simple: reach the Coalition, assess the situation, and determine how best to help them resist the Galactic Council's advance. Everything else was left to his discretion, which was exactly how he preferred it.
Just one, sir. What's my extraction plan? Morrison's expression grew slightly uncomfortable. There isn't one. This is a one-way mission, Cole.
If you succeed in helping the Coalition, you'll stay and coordinate with them.
If you fail. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Marcus shrugged. Understood. When do I leave? Launch window opens in 6 hours.
The ship's autopilot will handle most of the navigation, but you'll need to be conscious for course corrections and when you reach Coalition space.
As the final preparations continued around them, Marcus reviewed what little intelligence they had about the enemy he was about to face.
The Galactic Council controlled roughly 60% of the known galaxy, ruling through a combination of technological superiority and ruthless efficiency. They didn't negotiate, didn't accept surrender, and didn't leave survivors who might cause future problems. They were also, according to the Coalition's desperate message, completely unprepared for asymmetric warfare. They fought like the dominant power they were, using overwhelming force to crush resistance before it could organize. They had never faced an enemy that specialized in turning their strengths into weaknesses. "Sir," Santos called from beside the ship's entry hatch. "We need to run through the startup sequence one more time." The next 4 hours passed in a blur of systems checks, equipment verification, and last-minute modifications. The ship's interior was cramped but functional, with alien technology interfaced somewhat crudely with human equipment. The pilot's seat had been modified to fit human physiology, and the control displays had been overlaid with English translations that the engineers hoped were accurate. As lunchtime approached, Marcus sealed himself into the ship's cockpit and began the departure sequence. The alien engines came online with a sound like distant thunder, and he felt the artificial gravity adjust as the vessel lifted off from the hangar floor.
Control, this is Shadowwalker. All systems nominal, departing on schedule. Copy that, Shadow Walker. Godspeed, Marcus.
Bring our new friends some hope. The ship cleared Earth's atmosphere in minutes, its propulsion system far more advanced than anything humanity had developed. As the blue curve of his home planet fell away behind him, Marcus activated the faster-than-light drive and felt reality twist around him in ways that human senses weren't designed to process. The stars streaked past like silver rain, and he was alone in the void, carrying humanity's answer to a question the galaxy hadn't known it was asking. 3 weeks into the journey, Marcus received the last transmission from Earth before the distance became too great for communication. The message was brief: intelligence satellites had detected massive energy signatures moving toward Coalition space. The Council was launching their final assault. Marcus pushed the ship's engines to their maximum safe output, racing against time toward a war he might already be too late to effect.
The alien vessel responded to his urgency, its advanced systems compensating for the increased stress with efficiency that human technology couldn't match. During the long hours of flight, he studied everything the Coalition had told them about their enemy. The Council's military doctrine was based on shock and overwhelming force. They would jump massive fleets into a system, destroy all military resistance within hours, and then systematically dismantle the infrastructure of any world that had opposed them. It was an effective strategy against conventional enemies, but Marcus had never been particularly conventional. His plans began to take shape during the quiet hours between stars, ideas forming around the enemy's assumptions and blind spots. When the ship finally dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Coalition space, Marcus was greeted by a sight that confirmed his worst fears. The system was full of debris, the twisted remains of hundreds of ships floating in expanding clouds of wreckage. In the distance, a planet burned with fires visible from space. A transmission reached him almost immediately: weak and desperate, unknown vessel, this is Coalition Command. Identify yourself immediately or be fired upon. Marcus activated the communication system, hoping the translation matrix would work as intended. Coalition Command, this is Marcus Cole, representing the species humanity. I'm here in response to your request for a champion. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before the reply came, and Marcus could hear the exhaustion in the alien voice even through the translation. Human, you are either very brave or very foolish to come here now. The Council fleet arrived 2 days ago. We have perhaps hours before our final positions are overrun. Understood, Command. Request permission to dock with your command vessel. I need to speak with your leadership immediately. Human, I don't think you understand. This war is over. We sent that message months ago as a desperate gesture, but no help came in time. You should leave while you still can. Marcus looked out at the burning planet and the wreckage of what had once been a proud fleet, and felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd seen this before: good people dying because bad people had more guns. But he'd also learned that wars weren't always won by the side with the most firepower. Command, patch me through to every ship, every station, every soldier who can still fight. I have something to say. Human, what can one person possibly say that will change anything now? Marcus smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. You asked for humanity's champion. You're about to find out what that means. When the communication channel opened, carrying his voice to the scattered remnants of the Coalition forces, Marcus spoke with quiet confidence that cut through their despair like a blade through silk. My name is Marcus Cole. My species has a saying: it's not over until it's over. The Council thinks they've won because they destroyed your fleets and burned your worlds. They think victory is measured in tonnage and firepower. They're about to learn that they're wrong. He paused, looking out at the debris field that represented the Coalition's conventional military power. I've come here to teach them a lesson that my species learned a long time ago. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one who has nothing left to lose and refuses to quit. The response came from a dozen sources at once, voices speaking in alien languages but all carrying the same desperate hope. Someone had come. Someone had answered their call. Marcus began issuing orders, his voice carrying an authority that needed no translation. The real war was about to begin. The Coalition command ship was a massive vessel, easily 10 times larger than anything Earth had ever built, but it showed the scars of recent battle. Burn marks scored its hull, and several sections had been sealed off due to atmospheric breaches. As Marcus's small ship docked with the command vessel, he could see repair crews working frantically to keep their home operational.
Commander Zaravas met him at the airlock, and Marcus got his first close look at an alien being. She stood nearly 7 feet tall, with scaled skin that shifted between blue and green depending on the angle of the light. Forearms moved with fluid precision, and her large eyes held intelligence tempered by exhaustion and grief. "So you are the human champion," she said, her voice carrying an odd harmonic quality that the translation device rendered in flat, mechanical tones.
"I expected someone larger."
Marcus stepped off his ship and looked around the hangar bay. Even accounting for alien design preferences, everything here was built on a massive scale. The Coalition clearly believed that bigger was better, which explained a lot about how they'd been fighting this war.
"Size isn't everything, Commander.
I'd like to see your tactical displays and get a full briefing on the Council's capabilities." Zaravas led him through corridors that could have accommodated Earth vehicles, past chambers filled with technology Marcus couldn't begin to understand. Other aliens moved through the ship, some humanoid, others so different from Earth life that his brain struggled to process them as living beings. But they all shared the same expression of desperate hope when they saw him. The command center was a cathedral of holographic displays and control stations, with dozens of beings monitoring various aspects of the ongoing disaster. The main tactical display showed the entire star system, with red markers indicating Council forces and the few remaining blue markers representing Coalition survivors.
"This is what we face," Zaravas said, gesturing to the display.
The Council's 7th Fleet, 300 heavy battleships, 1,200 support vessels, and carrier groups that can deploy fighters by the thousands. They've positioned themselves around our industrial worlds and are systematically destroying our ability to resist. Marcus studied the display, noting ship positions, patrol routes, and the Council's formation patterns.
"What's their operational doctrine? How do they typically engage targets?"
"Overwhelming force at maximum range," replied Subcommander Thek, a being that resembled a giant spider with too many eyes.
"They coordinate massive bombardments that can break planetary shields in minutes, then move in with occupation forces."
"They've never needed to adapt their tactics because no one has ever survived their initial assault long enough to make adaptation necessary." "Show me their flagship," Marcus said. The display zoomed in on a vessel that dwarfed even the massive Coalition ships. It was a geometric nightmare of weapon systems and armor plating, bristling with enough firepower to level continents.
"The Dominion's fist," Zaravas said with obvious hatred. "Fleet Admiral Korax commands from there. He's the one who ordered the civilian evacuation transports destroyed. 12 million beings, including children, murdered as a demonstration of Council power."
Marcus felt that familiar cold anger settle in his chest, the same feeling he'd had when facing terrorists and war criminals back on Earth.
Some people needed killing, and this Admiral Korax had just made himself a priority target. "What assets do we have left?"
43 ships of various classes, most damaged.
"Perhaps 8,000 fighters, though half of those lack pilots."
"Ground forces on 3 worlds, but they're cut off and can't affect space operations."
Zaravas's secondary arms moved in what Marcus interpreted as a gesture of hopelessness.
"We can make them pay for their victory, but we cannot prevent it."
Marcus walked closer to the display, studying the Council formation.
They were positioned like they expected conventional attacks, overlapping fields of fire, mutual support, heavy units protecting their supply lines. It was textbook fleet tactics for fighting other fleets. "Commander, I need you to gather every surviving ship captain, every squadron leader, every person with command authority.
We're going to have a strategy meeting."
"Human Marcus, I appreciate your desire to help, but what can one person do against such overwhelming odds? We've tried everything: massed attacks, guerrilla raids, targeting their supply lines.
Nothing has worked."
Marcus turned from the display to look directly at Zaravas.
"That's because you've been fighting the war they wanted you to fight.
You've been playing by their rules, using their tactics, meeting their strengths with your strengths.
That's how you lose to a superior enemy. Then, how do you win? You change the rules.
You turn their strengths into weaknesses and force them to fight a war they don't understand."
Marcus pointed at the enemy fleet display. "Look at them.
They're positioned for maximum firepower and mutual defense. They have overlapping sensor coverage, coordinated patrol routes, and enough redundancy to handle any conventional attack."
"Exactly.
Which is why we cannot defeat them. Or why they're perfect targets." Marcus smiled, and something in his expression made several aliens step back involuntarily.
"Commander, your people have been thinking like prey. It's time to start thinking like predators.
Over the next hour, as coalition commanders gathered in the command center, Marcus laid out his assessment of the situation. The Council forces were indeed overwhelming in a conventional engagement, but they had weaknesses that could be exploited by an enemy willing to fight unconventionally. Their doctrine assumes rational actors making logical decisions, he explained to the assembled commanders. They expect enemies to preserve their forces, to avoid suicide missions, to fight for territory and resources. They've built their entire strategy around defeating people who fight the way they do.
Captain Renth, a crystalline being whose voice sounded like wind chimes, spoke up. Are you suggesting we behave irrationally? That we throw away our lives for no purpose?
I'm suggesting we do things they won't expect because they seem irrational from their perspective.
In human military history, we have a term for this: asymmetric warfare. When you can't match the enemy's strength, you attack their assumptions.
Marcus moved to the tactical display and began highlighting specific council ships. For instance, they've positioned their command vessels in the center of their formation, protected by layers of escorts and defensive screens.
It's the safest possible position against conventional attack. And
it means their admirals have never had to fight for their lives personally. They make decisions from positions of complete safety, which makes them predictable. People make different choices when they might personally die from those choices. He touched several points on the display. Their supply ships are protected but not heavily armed. Their fighter carriers are positioned for maximum deployment speed but minimum defensive capability. Their patrol routes are efficient but predictable.
Every advantage they have creates a corresponding vulnerability.
Sub-Commander Thek's multiple eyes focused on Marcus with what might have been understanding. You want to target their weaknesses instead of attacking their strengths.
More than that. I want to make their strengths irrelevant. Marcus pulled up a detailed scan of the Council flagship. That ship can destroy any vessel in your fleet in a one-on-one engagement.
But it can't fight what it can't see, and it can't shoot at targets that aren't there.
For the first time since Marcus had arrived, Zaravos looked interested rather than resigned. What exactly are you proposing?
A series of coordinated operations designed to disrupt their command structure, eliminate their strategic advantages, and force them to fight the kind of war they're not prepared for. We're going to turn this fleet action into a close-quarters brawl where their superior firepower doesn't matter.
Marcus spent the next 3 hours detailing his plan, answering questions, and adapting his strategy to account for coalition capabilities and resources.
The alien commanders listened with growing amazement as he outlined operations that violated every principle of conventional space warfare. "This is insane," Captain Renth finally said.
Half of these operations would be considered suicide missions under normal circumstances. Good thing these aren't normal circumstances, Marcus replied. The Council expects you to value your lives more than victory. They're counting on you to make the safe choice, the rational choice, the choice that preserves your forces for another day. He looked around the room at the assembled commanders. But there isn't going to be another day. They're here to finish you, and they have the firepower to do it. Your only chance is to do something so unexpected, so seemingly impossible, that their entire tactical framework collapses. Zaravos was quiet for a long moment, studying the tactical projections Marcus had created. "Human Marcus, if we attempt this plan, most of us will die." "Yes. But if you don't attempt it, all of you will die, along with every civilian the Council decides is a threat to their authority. At least this way, you take some of them with you." "And if we succeed?" Marcus looked out through the command center's viewport at the burning planet in the distance. "If we succeed, we send a message that will reach every corner of the galaxy. We prove that the Council can be beaten, that their fleets can be destroyed, that their admirals can die just like anyone else." He turned back to the assembled commanders. "We turn them from conquerors into just another enemy that can be killed." The room fell silent as each commander considered what Marcus was asking of them. Finally, Zaravos spoke for all of them. "When do we begin?" Marcus checked the chronometer on his wrist, calculating time delays and operational requirements. "In 6 hours. That gives us time to position our assets and prepare the battlefield." As the meeting broke up and commanders hurried to their ships to begin preparations, Zaravos remained behind with Marcus. "Human, I must ask, why are you doing this? Your species has no stake in this war. You could have stayed safe on your distant world." Marcus looked out at the stars, thinking of Earth and the people he'd left behind. Because someone has to. Because if good people don't fight back, then evil wins by default. He turned to face her. And, because sometimes, Commander, the best way to protect your home is to make sure your enemies are too busy dying to threaten it. Zaravas made a gesture that Marcus had learned was the coalition equivalent of a salute. It has been an honor, human Marcus. The honor's mine, Commander. Now let's go teach the Council what happens when they pick on someone their own size. Outside the viewport, the Council fleet maintained its perfect formation, confident in its invincibility. In a few hours, that confidence would prove to be their fatal weakness. Fleet Admiral Corex stood on the command bridge of the Dominion's Fist, watching his tactical displays with the satisfaction of a predator that had cornered its prey. The Coalition's last strongholds would fall within hours, and, with them, the final organized resistance in this sector of the galaxy. Another successful demonstration of Council superiority. Admiral, his communications officer reported, were detecting unusual movement patterns among the surviving Coalition vessels. They appear to be regrouping. Corex barely glanced at the display. Let them. A few dozen damaged ships cannot threaten this fleet. Continue bombardment of the industrial facilities on the third planet. The Admiral was a veteran of 47 campaigns, and he had learned that the key to maintaining Council dominance was overwhelming force applied swiftly and, without mercy. Fear was more effective than negotiation, and dead enemies caused fewer problems than living ones. Sir, the Coalition vessels are accelerating toward our outer patrol lines. Suicide attacks, then. Route additional escorts to reinforce the perimeter. Let them dash themselves against our defenses and die with whatever dignity they think they possess. What Corex couldn't know was that 3 Coalition ships weren't heading for his patrol lines at all. Disguised by electronic countermeasures that Marcus had helped them implement, they were moving toward entirely different targets using flight paths that avoided the Council's sensor nets. Marcus sat in the cockpit of a modified Coalition fighter, part of a squadron that officially no longer existed according to the Council's tactical computers. The stealth modifications his human engineering knowledge had made possible weren't perfect, but they didn't need to be. They only needed to work long enough to get him close to the Council's logistics vessels. Hunter Leader, this is Shadow Walker, he whispered into his communication device. I'm approaching the target zone. Begin your runs in 30 seconds. Copy, Shadow Walker. All Hunter units, weapons armed and ready. The Council supply convoy was positioned exactly where Marcus had predicted, close enough to the main fleet for protection, far enough away to avoid cluttering the tactical displays with non-essential vessels. 17 massive freighters carrying everything from ammunition to spare parts to food for the thousands of beings manning the Council fleet. Marcus had learned long ago that armies moved on their stomachs, whether those armies were human or alien. Destroy the logistics chain, and even the most powerful military force became vulnerable. His fighter dropped out of stealth mode just as it reached attack range, targeting systems locking onto the convoy's lead vessel. The other members of his squadron emerged from electronic invisibility at the same moment, their weapons aimed at carefully selected targets. All units, engage. The attack lasted less than 3 minutes, but, by the time it was over, 14 of the 17 supply ships were either destroyed or crippled beyond repair. The escort vessels never had time to respond effectively, they had been positioned to defend against attacks from the direction of the Coalition forces, not from seemingly empty space. Phase 1 complete, Marcus reported as his squadron vanished back into electronic invisibility. Moving to Phase 2 coordinates. Across the system, similar attacks were taking place as Coalition forces implemented Marcus's strategy of attacking the enemy's assumptions rather than their strengths. While the Council fleet maintained its perfect defensive formation, its support infrastructure was being systematically dismantled by enemies who were supposed to be making desperate last stands. On the Dominion's Fist, alarms began sounding as reports flooded in from across the fleet. Admiral, we've lost the primary supply convoy. 14 ships destroyed with minimal enemy losses detected. Corex frowned at his tactical display. How many Coalition vessels participated in the attack? Unknown, sir. Our escorts report engaging small fighter squadrons, but the electronic warfare environment makes accurate counts impossible. Redirect 2 battle groups to provide additional convoy protection. These raids are an annoyance, nothing more. What Corex didn't realize was that the supply convoy attack had been carefully timed to coincide with Phase 2 of Marcus's plan.
As Council vessels moved to reinforce their logistics network, they weakened the defensive screen around their command ships. Captain Zaravos led a squadron of coalition vessels in what appeared to be a desperate frontal assault against the Council's outer perimeter. Her ships charged directly into the teeth of the enemy formation, weapons blazing in what seemed like a textbook suicide run. The Council responded exactly as Marcus had predicted, concentrating fire on the obvious threat while ignoring the space around their flanks. They never saw the coalition boarding pods that had been launched from extreme range, coasting through space on minimal power until they were close enough to attach to Council vessels. Marcus had introduced the coalition commanders to a concept that was routine in human special operations but completely alien to galactic warfare: boarding actions against vessels in space. The Council's security protocols were designed to prevent unauthorized access at dock, not to repel armed boarders who cut through hulls with industrial equipment. 12 Council vessels suddenly found themselves fighting enemies inside their own corridors, their superior firepower useless against opponents who were already past their defenses. The boarding parties had simple objectives: disable the ship's weapons, destroy its communication equipment, and create as much chaos as possible. Admiral, we have internal security alerts on multiple vessels. Unknown hostiles have somehow gotten aboard our ships. Korex stared at his displays in disbelief. How is that possible? Our shields are active, our defensive screens are in place. Unknown, sir. Security teams are responding, but the boarders appear to be using some kind of advanced infiltration techniques. What they were actually using was Marcus's knowledge of how to turn a ship's own systems against its crew. Coalition engineers, guided by human insights into asymmetric warfare, had learned to overload power conduits to create diversions, hack environmental controls to flood sections with sleep gas, and use maintenance shafts to move through areas where the ship's security forces couldn't follow. As reports of successful boardings continued to arrive, Korex made the decision that Marcus had been counting on. He ordered his scattered battle groups to return to the main formation to provide mutual support against these unconventional attacks. It was exactly the wrong decision. Phase 3 is go, Marcus announced to his scattered forces. All units, execute on my mark. The coalition vessels that had been conducting holding actions across the system suddenly coordinated their movements with precision that caught the Council fleet completely off guard. Instead of random desperate attacks, they began to converge on the Council formation from multiple vectors simultaneously. But they weren't aiming for the heavily defended capital ships. They were targeting the smaller vessels, destroyers, frigates, and escort carriers that formed the defensive screen around the Council's heavy units. Marcus led the assault personally, his small fighter squadron diving through the Council formation like sharks through a school of fish. The enemy's massive weapons couldn't track targets moving at such close range without risking damage to their own ships, and their smaller defensive systems were overwhelmed by the sheer audacity of the attack. All units, concentrate fire on their sensor arrays and communication equipment. Blind them and isolate them. The coalition had learned that in space combat, information was more valuable than firepower. A fleet that couldn't see its enemies or communicate with its scattered elements was just a collection of individual ships, each fighting its own isolated battle. On the Dominion's fist, Korex watched his perfect formation dissolve into chaos as his subordinate commanders lost contact with each other and began making independent tactical decisions based on incomplete information. Sir, we're losing communication with half the fleet. Something is jamming our channels. Then, use backup frequencies. They're jamming those too, sir. And our sensor efficiency is down 40% due to some kind of electronic warfare system we've never encountered before. Marcus had taught the coalition about the power of integrated electronic warfare, showing them how to use their technical sophistication to create cascading failures in enemy systems. The Council's technology was advanced, but it was also standardized and predictable. Once you understood how it worked, you could find ways to make it work against itself. Hunter Leader, this is Shadow Walker. I'm beginning my attack run on the flagship. Shadow Walker, that's suicide. The Dominion's fist has enough defensive fire to stop a battle fleet. Maybe. But those defenses are designed to stop conventional attacks from conventional vectors. I'm not feeling particularly conventional today. Marcus's fighter dove toward the massive Council flagship, not from the side or above where its weapons could engage him, but from directly ahead, using the ship's own engine wash to mask his approach. It was a maneuver that would have been impossible in atmospheric flight, but, in space, physics worked differently. The Dominion's Fist's defensive systems weren't designed to engage single fighters approaching from the engine vector. It was considered impossible for such small craft to survive in that environment. But Marcus had spent years doing impossible things, and the radiation and electromagnetic interference that should have killed him instead provided perfect concealment. He reached attack range before the flagship's crew even realized he was there, his fighter's weapons armed with a special package the Coalition engineers had prepared based on his specifications. Not explosives or conventional warheads, but something far more dangerous to a modern starship, a computer virus designed to cascade through the vessel's integrated systems. Package delivered, Marcus announced as his fighter pulled away from the flagship. Recommend all Coalition units withdraw to minimum safe distance. The virus worked exactly as designed, spreading through the Dominion's Fist's computer networks like wildfire, turning the ship's own advanced systems against it. Weapons fired at random targets, environmental controls fluctuated wildly, and navigation systems provided contradictory information to different sections of the vessel. But, most importantly, the ship's communication array began broadcasting on all frequencies at maximum power, sending the same message repeatedly to every Council vessel in the system. This is Fleet Admiral Corex. All vessels are ordered to withdraw immediately. Repeat, general withdrawal order in effect. The enemy has weapons we cannot counter. The message was, of course, a fabrication created by Marcus and Coalition cryptographers. But, in the chaos of electronic warfare and communications disruption, individual Council commanders had no way to verify its authenticity. Faced with unusual attacks, isolated from their chain of command, and receiving what appeared to be direct orders from their admiral, they did what military personnel always do when in doubt. They followed orders. One by one, Council vessels began breaking off from the engagement and retreating toward the system's edge. What had started as an orderly withdrawal quickly became a rout as panic spread through their ranks. On the real command bridge of the Dominion's Fist, Admiral Corex watched his fleet dissolve around him as systems failures cascaded through his flagship and his carefully planned victory turned into inexplicable defeat. Communications, order all vessels to maintain their positions. Ignore any withdrawal orders not verified through primary encryption. Sir, our communication systems are non-functional. We can't send any orders at all. Corex stared at his tactical displays, watching 300 vessels retreat in disorder from a handful of enemy ships that should have been destroyed hours ago. In 47 campaigns, he had never faced anything like this. The Coalition was fighting with tactics and strategies that violated every principle of galactic warfare. Sir, his tactical officer reported with obvious confusion, we're detecting a single small craft approaching our position. It appears to be broadcasting a communication request. On screen. The figure that appeared on the main display was unlike anything in the Council's xenological databases. Bipedal, obviously intelligent, but from no species in their records. When it spoke, the translation matrix struggled to process the alien language. Admiral Corex, this is Marcus Cole, representing the species humanity and the Coalition resistance. I'm calling to discuss terms. Corex found his voice after a moment of stunned silence. Terms? You're in a single fighter facing the most powerful warship in the galaxy. What terms could you possibly offer? Marcus smiled, and something in that expression made the Admiral step back from his display. I'm offering you the chance to surrender before this gets ugly. You've lost half your fleet, your supply lines are cut, and your communications are compromised. This is your opportunity to walk away. Impossible. No single being could coordinate the kind of operation you've just conducted. You're clearly just a spokesperson for some larger Coalition command structure. Actually, Admiral, I'm exactly what the Coalition said I was, humanity's champion. And you're about to learn what that means. Marcus paused, looking directly into the camera with eyes that held no warmth at all. You see, my species has a long history of warfare, and we've learned something that apparently never occurred to you. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one with the biggest guns or the most ships. Then, what is? The one who has nothing left to lose and refuses to quit. The transmission ended, leaving Admiral Corex staring at a blank screen while around him, his invincible fleet continued its inexplicable retreat from an enemy that shouldn't have been able to offer any resistance at all. In the distance, Coalition vessels regrouped around their mysterious human ally, preparing for whatever impossible thing he would ask them to do next. 3 months after the Battle of Kepler's Edge, as the galactic media had begun calling it, the repercussions were still spreading across the known galaxy like ripples from a throne stone. Admiral Korex sat in a detention cell on the Coalition world of Haven Prime, contemplating how thoroughly his understanding of warfare had proven inadequate.
The final phase of the battle had been unlike anything in recorded military history.
After his fleet's chaotic retreat, Marcus Cole had done something that violated every principle of civilized warfare. He had pursued them. Not with the Coalition's remaining ships, which were too damaged for sustained pursuit, but with captured Council vessels whose crews had been convinced to switch sides. The human had somehow managed to turn defeated enemies into allies, offering them something the Council never had, the chance to choose their own fate. Korex rubbed his temples, still trying to understand how a single being had managed to coordinate operations across multiple star systems while simultaneously conducting psychological warfare, strategic planning, and tactical command. The official reports made it sound like the human had been in 12 places at once, personally leading boarding actions while directing fleet movements and negotiating surrender terms. The cell door opened, and Marcus Cole entered with a datapad and a cup of something that smelled like earth coffee. The human looked tired but satisfied, wearing the same simple uniform he'd had throughout the campaign. "Admiral," Marcus said, settling into the chair across from Korex.
"How are they treating you?" "Well enough, considering. I assume you're here to gloat about your victory."
Marcus shook his head.
"Actually, I'm here because the Coalition leadership wants to understand something.
In 47 campaigns, you never lost a single engagement. You were considered one of the finest strategic minds in Council space.
So what happened?"
Korex was quiet for a long moment, studying the being who had dismantled his career and his worldview with equal efficiency.
"You happened. You and your species' approach to warfare, which is completely irrational by any civilized standard." "How so?" "You treat war as personal.
Your strategies assume that individual psychology matters more than technological superiority. You fight as if the outcome of each engagement could determine the fate of your entire species."
Korex gestured at the walls around them.
"Most galactic civilizations fight wars to achieve specific political or economic objectives. You fight wars to win."
Marcus nodded slowly. "That's probably accurate. But there's something else, isn't there?
Something about the way we approached this particular conflict that you're still trying to understand."
Korex leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You never fought the war I expected you to fight.
Every time I predicted your next move, you did something that seemed tactically foolish but strategically brilliant.
You sacrificed advantages to create opportunities.
You turned retreats into advances and defeats into victories.
The Coalition leaders want to know if you think other Council fleets will adapt to these tactics."
"Some will try," Korex admitted.
"But adaptation requires understanding, and I'm not sure most Council commanders will be willing to admit that their fundamental assumptions about warfare are flawed."
Marcus made notes on his datapad. The Coalition's military leaders were already implementing the lessons learned from the battle, but they needed to know what they would face when the Council inevitably returned in greater force.
"Admiral, I want to ask you about something specific.
During the battle, when your communications were compromised and your fleet was retreating, you had opportunities to regroup and counterattack.
Your remaining forces still outnumbered ours significantly. Why didn't you press the attack?"
Korex was quiet for several minutes, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight Marcus hadn't heard before.
"Because for the first time in my career, I was afraid."
"Afraid of losing?"
"No. Afraid of an enemy I didn't understand." Korex met Marcus's eyes. "Human, in 47 campaigns, I always knew what my opponents wanted. Territory, resources, political concessions, survival.
I could predict their behavior because their motivations were rational and comprehensible." He paused, choosing his words carefully.
"But you and your Coalition allies fought like beings who wanted something I couldn't identify or predict.
You made decisions that seemed to ignore the logical calculus of warfare. You treated each engagement as if the stakes were absolute, as if failure meant the end of everything you valued."
Marcus nodded.
"Because from our perspective, it did.
The Council doesn't negotiate, doesn't accept surrender, doesn't leave survivors. When someone like that comes for your people, you fight with everything you have because the alternative is extinction."
"But that's just it," Korex said, leaning forward. "Most species, when faced with extinction, either surrender and hope for mercy or make desperate last stands that accomplish nothing but glorious deaths.
You did something else entirely."
"Which was?"
You made extinction seem like the less frightening option for your enemies. The interview continued for another hour, covering tactical details and strategic implications that would inform coalition planning for years to come. When Marcus finally left, he carried with him the confirmation of something he'd suspected since the battle began. The Council's military advantage was built on assumptions that could be challenged by enemies willing to fight differently. Outside the detention facility, Commander Zaravas was waiting with a transport to the Coalition Capitol building. The past months had transformed her from a defeated military officer into one of the key architects of the new interspecies alliance that was emerging from the ashes of the Council's galactic dominance. "How did it go?" she asked as they lifted off from the facility. "About what I expected. The Council trained their officers to fight wars against rational opponents with limited objectives. They're not prepared for total war against enemies who refuse to accept defeat." Zaravas nodded. The intelligence reports from liberated Council worlds support that assessment. Their military doctrine is completely built around the assumption that superior force will always prevail against inferior force. "Which is true, as long as everyone agrees on what constitutes victory," Marcus replied, watching the Coalition capital city pass beneath them. The reconstruction was proceeding rapidly, with architectural styles from dozens of different species creating a unique blend of alien engineering and artistic vision. "Marcus, there's something the Coalition Council wants to discuss with you. Something about the long-term implications of your species joining the galactic community." Marcus had been expecting this conversation. Humanity's intervention in the war had been successful beyond anyone's expectations, but it had also revealed capabilities that made some Coalition members nervous. Earth's military doctrines, applied to galactic-scale conflicts, were proving devastatingly effective against enemies who had never encountered such approaches. The Coalition Capitol building was a massive structure that housed representatives from over 60 different species, all united by their shared experience of surviving Council aggression. As Marcus walked through the corridors, he could see the effect his presence had on the various beings they passed. Some looked at him with gratitude, others with curiosity, and a few with what might have been concern. The main Council chamber was designed to accommodate the widely varying physiological requirements of its members. Environmental controls adjusted automatically to provide appropriate atmospheric conditions for each species, while translation devices ensured that communication remained clear despite the dozens of different languages in use. Coalition President Threshka, a being that resembled a cross between a tree and a crystal formation, addressed Marcus as he entered the chamber. "Human Marcus, we are grateful that you could join us today. We have much to discuss regarding your species' role in the new galactic order that is emerging from this conflict." Marcus took his designated seat, noting that it had been positioned to provide clear sightlines to all the other representatives. Everything about the arrangement suggested that while he was welcome, he was also being carefully evaluated. "President Threshka, I'm honored to participate in these discussions. Earth is committed to supporting the Coalition's efforts to build a more equitable galactic community." Representative Qual, whose species resembled bipedal dolphins, spoke next. "Marcus of Humanity, your species' military capabilities have proven impressive. But we must address concerns about the implications of these capabilities for long-term stability." Marcus had been briefed on this concern by Zaravas during their journey to the capital. Several Coalition species were worried that humanity's approach to warfare might make them as dangerous as the Council they had defeated. "I understand the concern, Representative Qual. Earth has no interest in becoming the Council's replacement as a galactic hegemon. Our goal has always been to ensure that species like yours have the freedom to determine their own destinies." "But how can we be certain of this?" asked Representative Hidemine 7, whose collective consciousness spoke through multiple bodies simultaneously. "Your species has demonstrated the ability to coordinate military operations that defeated supposedly invincible enemies. What prevents you from using these same capabilities against us if your interests diverge from ours?" Marcus considered his response carefully. This was the crucial moment that would determine whether humanity would be accepted as a partner or feared as a potential threat. "Representatives, I want to share something with you about human history that might address your concerns. My species has fought wars for as long as we've existed, and we've learned some hard lessons about the relationship between military power and political stability." He stood, moving to the chamber's central display system. "The strongest militaries don't always belong to the most stable societies. In fact, societies that rely primarily on military force to maintain their position tend to collapse when they encounter enemies they can't defeat conventionally.
Marcus activated a historical display showing Earth's major conflicts over the past several centuries. We've learned that sustainable power comes not from the ability to defeat any enemy, but from the ability to make enemies into allies. The tactics we used against the Council aren't just about winning battles, they're about creating conditions where battles become unnecessary. President Threshkaw leaned forward with interest. Explain this concept further. The Council ruled through fear and overwhelming force, which meant they always had to be stronger than any potential enemy. But that's an unsustainable model because it requires constant expansion and increasing militarization. Marcus highlighted specific examples from the historical display. Earth's approach is different. We prefer to build alliances, share technology, and create mutual dependencies that make conflict counterproductive. Representative Qual's expression became thoughtful. You're suggesting that humanity's military capabilities are designed to serve diplomatic rather than conquest objectives? Exactly. The deadliest human warrior is the one who never has to fight because potential enemies would rather be allies. Marcus returned to his seat. That's why Earth is proposing something unprecedented in galactic history, a complete sharing of our military doctrines and training methods with any coalition species that wants them. The chamber erupted in surprised discussion as representatives absorbed the implications of Marcus's offer. No galactic power had ever voluntarily shared their military secrets with potential rivals. Representative Hivemine 7 spoke for the collective confusion in the room. This proposal makes no logical sense. Why would you surrender your primary advantage? Marcus smiled. Because our primary advantage was never the secrecy of our tactics. It was our willingness to use them when necessary and our preference for not having to use them at all. He looked around the chamber at the assembled representatives. The council fell because they believed that power came from keeping others weak. Humanity's approach is different. We believe that power comes from making others strong enough to stand with us. And if we become strong enough to stand against you? President Threshkaw asked. Marcus's expression grew serious. Then, we'll have succeeded in creating the kind of galaxy where that choice exists. And, honestly, that's exactly what we're hoping for. The discussions continued for hours, covering everything from technology transfer to mutual defense agreements to the establishment of joint training programs. By the end of the session, the coalition had agreed to form what they called the Galactic Defense Initiative, a voluntary association of species committed to mutual protection and shared military development. As the session concluded and representatives began to file out, Zarabas approached Marcus with obvious satisfaction. I think that went better than anyone expected. Several species have already expressed interest in sending military observers to Earth for training. Marcus nodded, but his attention was focused on a priority communication that had just arrived on his personal device. The message was brief but significant: Council remnant fleets massing in the outer spiral. Estimated strength, 2,000 vessels. Request immediate consultation. Admiral Morrison, Earth Defense Command. Commander, Marcus said, showing Zarabas the message, it looks like our work isn't finished yet. Zarabas read the communication with growing concern. 2,000 ships? That's larger than the fleet we just defeated. Yes, but there's a difference this time, Marcus replied, looking out at the coalition capital where representatives from dozens of species were working together to build something unprecedented in galactic history. This time, they're not just facing one species fighting alone. They're facing an alliance of enemies who've learned how to fight the way humanity fights. He smiled, and Zarabas recognized the expression that had come to be associated with impossible victories and defeated enemies. The Council wanted to teach the galaxy about the consequences of resistance. I think it's time we taught them about the consequences of making enemies out of friends. Outside the Capitol building, ships from a dozen different species were already departing for their home systems, carrying plans and training materials that would transform galactic warfare forever. The universe was about to discover that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't any particular tactic or technology. It was their ability to turn diversity into strength, fear into determination, and enemies into allies willing to fight for something better than mere survival. The real war for the future of the galaxy was just beginning.